Okay, let's continue with our discussion of theory of the social change and social complexity. We're talking again about this period between the Neolithic Revolution and the Urban Revolution, where a changes took place in society, reorganization based on some new set of factors that had never really existed before sedentism and domestication took place. Small-scale communities were mostly egalitarian. You did have some larger communities in the early Neolithic period that started to reorganize themselves. We've seen that in previous chapters. To start to address some of the new conditions and pressures that were on them. So if you live in a larger community, you've got to deal with things like waste disposal. If you are all living cramped together, then sanitation becomes an issue. So who organizes that? Do you do it on your just to do it? Whose job is it to get rid of waste? Whose job is it to plan? Whose job is it to settle disputes when you're living right on top of one another? You're going to come into conflict. So you see that society has some new things to deal with when you're living in settled communities, when you're living with the idea of property and home and territory, and your life depends on those things. So you see that social complexity is starting to emerge during this time. And once again, Gordon Childe, our hero of old, had some things to say about what the urban revolution was in archaeological terms. How does an archaeologist know that you're looking at an urban society rather than something that is pre-urban or pre-state level? Well, Childe had a checklist. He was like, okay, if you've got these things, and you're probably looking at a state. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the next chapter again, but his 10 criteria for an urban society was that A, you had to have an urban center. You had to have a population that you could call urban. So you can't have a tiny little village of 10 people and call it a city. It's just not enough people. You also don't need the sort of social organization with a group of 10 or 20 people that you do with 10,000 or 20,000 people. There's just a simple organizational threshold that how do you get the opinions and thoughts and feelings of 10,000 people? You've got to break it down into groups. You've got to say, okay, you're a person that I'm going to put in charge of this 1,000 people, and you're another of this 1,000 people. So you've got 10 capos, and then you're the capo di tutti capi. You're the leader in charge of all of those sub-leaders, and then they're in charge of their cohort, and maybe you have additional levels of people. So there is a demographic concern. Also, to feed all of those people, you've got to have some sort of a surplus of food, and you've got to be able to store that. But you can't just let freeloaders take whatever they want whenever they want, even if they haven't worked for it. So you've got to have some sort of a system for who gets that differential access to this. And also that means people have to contribute what they produce to a central fund, which is done through taxes, and that's often overseen by some kind of an overlord. You also have specialized division of labor, that not everybody does every job. You divide up these tasks. So some people are farmers, some people are warriors, some people are accountants, some people are leaders, some people are architects, and so on down the line. If you live in an urban center, if you live in a city, if you live in a state, that's a pretty crucial part of this, is that the tasks are divided up into different roles, and these roles have ranks with them as well. The ditch digger isn't perhaps as high of a status as the overseer or the foreman who tells which diggers to dig which ditches and where and when and how many people are going to be doing that. And then you also have things like trade, which a city might not have all of the resources that it needs locally, and it might need to actually exchange with a wider area. But you're doing so now with the identity of a city or a state level identity that's trading then with another region that has another identity. So it's not just village to village or household to household, but it's state to state. You also have things like the ruling class. You have classes within society. Some of them are the top echelon and some of them are the bottom echelon. You even have things like slavery, and you have different statuses attached to different ranks in society. You also have some of the trappings of the consequences of having a state-level society that are kind of easy to see archaeologically because they leave really obvious traces. Things like monumental architecture. You need symbols around states. An urban society, a state-level society needs a flag. It needs something that everybody can say, that's my state. That's the symbol of my state. That represents me and that identity. So monumental architecture could be literally something, or sorry, one of these emblems of a society could be something like a flag, or it could be a monument like a pyramid or a palace or a temple. We also, with all of these complex economic and social interactions taking place and division of labor, someone has to keep track of all of this. And so the invention of writing and accounting and numeracy is invented, and also exact and predictive sciences. You also have standardization of things like arts and literature and representation being very indicative of a particular style and culture of this community. You know when a pot is made in your locality. You know when a drawing looks like it comes from your homeland. It represents you. It gives you a sense of identity. And this is sort of a self-referential idea that takes us back to Chapter 2 with agency and structure. This is a constantly reinforcing cycle of agents creating the structure, but then the structure impacting your agency. So these are Child's 10 criteria for society. This is going to relate to your essay question. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. The ideas that Child brought to the table, though, this isn't just something that, once again, like with the Neolithic Revolution, it doesn't matter if you were still a hunter and gatherer. Your life was affected by the Neolithic Revolution. We saw this in a place like Europe, where immigrants from the Middle East brought with them a new way of life, and it forever changed life in Europe. You couldn't be a hunter and gatherer because there were farms there, and you would get shooed off of their land that they now owned, whether you liked it or not. So the same thing goes with the urban revolution. It transformed the landscape. It was a reconceptualization of what the world was like. It was a new cosmology. It wasn't the Neolithic cosmology. It was now a very hierarchical and very rigid idea of the way the world and the universe operates. So this transformed all aspects of human life. And this is sort of easy to see archaeologically. Another thing that archaeologists have looked at is that it's not just urban centers that are transformed, it's whole regions. Regional identities start to spring up. Some of which is based on the fact that simply there's communities that are nearby one another. They might even share family groups. They might know one another. They might talk to one another. They might share a language. They might share a history. But also there's dependence that starts to happen. We talked about this a little bit with Çatalhöyük when we were talking about the growth of sedentary communities, that Çatalhöyük became a very high population, high density settlement, perhaps before they had really worked out how to do that. And there's a sort of a limit, a size limit to how large a village can be, because you've got to be able to walk a certain distance every day and then come back to your home if you want to go to your fields. So how far away can that be? 5 miles, 10 miles, 20 miles? That's 20 miles there and 20 miles back. There is a limit. If it's 50 miles away, if you need an area of 50 miles around your village to produce enough crops, enough harvest to feed your community, that might be too big. That might be too big of a community. You're not going to be able to have enough land to support that population. What can you do? Well, you can have satellite villages. So you have one big urban community that does the organization and controls smaller villages as little satellites. And maybe those little villages have smaller hamlets that are attached to them. And so Wright and Johnson talked about at least 3 levels of regional dependency, that you have an urban center, a primate site, and then you have smaller and smaller satellites that go down the line that are all dependent upon this network that's controlled through the urban center. And this has differential administrative structures as well, that the people in the tiny little hamlets aren't really responsible for administering the system. It's not just that you're smaller and smaller, it's you're also lesser and lesser importance. And this, of course, creates inequality in society by definition. And it occurs in all kinds of societies as well. That some people are going to be the haves and some are going to be the have-nots. If you own land, if you are in the Neolithic period and you're an early farmer, you're growing crops for you and your family. But when the urban revolution comes around, you're growing crops, and maybe it's your land, maybe it's not your land, maybe it's owned by the state. But in any case, you're not completely free with what you grow. You need other stuff, which means you've got to exchange for it, or maybe you're getting taxed for it. In fact, maybe everything that you grow goes to the state, and then they give you back what they think you deserve for your labor. So this creates a hierarchy based on ranks and prestige and status in society. But is this the same for all? Is every urban community the same? Do they all have to be this sort of rigid top-down approach? No, that's not. There are different trajectories in different cases. And so we're going to look at some of these when we come to these chapters later on. You can also have a variety of more complex societies that aren't organized in terms of state level or even complex societies that we've been talking about so far. You can have things like complex hunter-gatherers. You can have complex chiefdoms, which don't really make it to a state in terms of all of these criteria that we've listed. You can have pretty complex societies that undergo a lot of a broad range of resources. So maybe a mixture of agriculture and hunting and gathering. You can have villages, we've seen this before, that exist even with hunter-gatherer societies. And you can even have social hierarchy in some of these complex hunter-gatherer communities, including slavery. For example, your book brings up some Northwest Coast communities that have a lot of these factors that I've just mentioned. So the concept of the state is really important, and we're going to talk a lot about this in subsequent chapters. Part of the urban revolution is convincing people that the state is the proper order of things, that your relegation to some class in society is correct. Now, this is all reinforced through art and aesthetics and structure and language, and all of these things are contributing factors to just convince you that the state is correct, that the state is legitimate. Without that reinforcing structure, things like monuments and symbols, it's very difficult for a state to actually hold on to control and power. And what's the cutoff point when we can say this is a complex chiefdom and this is a state? Well, there isn't really one cutoff point. It's a continuum that's difficult to compare, especially when you're comparing societies to societies. So it's best if we just look at each community or each region that we're going to go through in its own terms and see their progression of development through time and see how they handled increasing social complexity. One important factor, however, is that primary states is really what this course is going to be looking at. Primary means that these are states that formed where no states had ever existed before. There are also, of course, secondary states, and these are the ones that formed when there was already an example of state-level organization that they knew about, that they were familiar with. For instance, Rome. Ancient Rome didn't come out of nowhere. It was preceded by the Etruscans and the Villanova culture, but they also borrowed a ton from the Greeks and elsewhere. So they already knew what a state was when Rome grew into the power that they became. So that's a classic secondary state. We will look at some of those, but our primary focus is going to be the ones that emerged from their agricultural and village roots into state-level identities when that had never existed before. That's going to be our primary focus. And these have appeared independently around the world more than once, these primary states. But it's important to look at the individual factors for their formation and then also their eventual collapse, because we do see the collapse of these societies. And then what happens once a state-level society collapses. So these are all involving humans. Humans are very similar, but are their societies similar? Yes, sometimes, but there are differences. So this is where we can compare and contrast. We can look at Mesoamerica, we can look at Mesopotamia, and we can say, all right, these are some things that they share, but they're not identical, and they have different trajectories, and they have different factors that led to their formation and collapse. There are regularities, things that are sort of universals. We all need to eat, we all need to drink, we all need to sleep, and we all need some sort of shelter. But the forms that we see in each of these communities is unique to their own set of circumstances. So we want to look at regularities and generalities, but we also need to make sure that we pay attention to the individual characters of each of these. And then I might take this a little bit further. We're looking at state-level identity, but there's sort of a super concept beyond that when states organize themselves into an even larger identity, which is what we call empires. And an empire is sort of an identity that consumes multiple state-level identities under one larger umbrella. And this is usually interregional. This can be done often when there's aggression. So there's aggressive expansion, sometimes coercion, sometimes it's done willingly, inclusion into an empire. Something like the Roman Empire or even the Persian Empire were largely peaceful expansions. They're like, we've got a good thing going on and you can join us, but don't oppose us because you'll regret it. So And often in these, like the Assyrians, often in some of these communities, like the Assyrians, you have a military elite, and there's prioritization of might and power. You also have cores and peripheries where the center, the expanding power is really where all the power is and continues to be. And the peripheral areas contribute resources and goods as a tribute, but they don't really have much control over the system itself. But keeping it all together requires investment and cooperation as well. And how does states form? Well, there's a lot of theories about this. We talked a little bit about this in my supplementary supplement to chapter 2. We tend not to think very much in terms of prime movers anymore. We've sort of gotten away in the past few decades away from someone trying to say, okay, this is the thing that caused this society to move in this direction, a prime mover. An example of that is Carl Wittfogel's hydraulic hypothesis, which he thought that it was all down to control of water in Mesopotamia in particular. That if you could control irrigation, you could then irrigate the plains of southern Mesopotamia, and then you could control that. And that, of course, meant you've got to control the people that dig the ditches for irrigation. You've got to have the engineers, and whoever's in charge of that whole infrastructure is in control of the whole power structure. There may be something to that, but there's a lot more going on. And so Robert Carnero, for instance, he was looking at a variety of factors, multivariate models, geography, population increase, violence, competition for resources. These are multivariate models for how states form. So anyway, I think that's all I really want to say about the theory behind this period between the Neolithic Revolution and the Urban Revolution, the expansion of social complexity, the intensification of it. And now let's break for now, and we'll come back and we'll talk about a few concrete examples in this time period.